The transmission came through on a frequency that every sentient species in the known galaxy monitored. It was the Universal Distress Channel, a bandwidth reserved for only the most catastrophic emergencies. The kind of signal that made station commanders pause mid-bite of their meals. The kind that made freighter captains pull their ships out of FTL and check their coordinates twice. The signal originated from the Meridian Conclave's primary relay station, orbiting the pale blue world of Velthara. A world that had, until 12 standard cycles ago, been the site of the largest humanitarian operation in galactic history. The voice that crackled through the static belonged to Counselor Orenvex, a Tenlar diplomat whose species was known for three things: their iridescent plumage, their inability to tell a lie without their crest feathers flattening in shame, and their absolutely pathological commitment to protocol. So when Orenvex broke protocol to broadcast on an open channel, every species with a receiver understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. This is Counselor Orenvex of the Meridian Conclave transmitting on all frequencies. I am issuing a Class 7 galactic alert. The Carthan Dominion has committed an act of unrestricted aggression against the Velthara medical mission. Multiple species aid workers have been killed. Human medical personnel have been targeted specifically. There was a pause, and in that pause, every being listening could hear the sound of something massive detonating somewhere near the counselor's position. I am requesting immediate evacuation assistance, and the transmission cut to static. For 17 seconds, the galaxy held its breath. Then a new voice came through. It was not Orenvex. It was not Tenlar. It was not any species that the Conclave's linguists could immediately identify, though the universal translators struggled to render it into something coherent. What came through was low, rhythmic, and seemed to carry harmonics that no organic vocal apparatus should have been capable of producing. This is Overwatch Actual. Conclave signal received. Be advised we are already inbound. All non-combatant personnel are advised to shelter in place and mark their positions with infrared strobes. Any armed individual not displaying a Conclave identifier within the established perimeter will be engaged. This is not a request. Overwatch Actual out. The signal died. And across 214 settled worlds, beings who had never heard of Overwatch Actual felt something cold settle into the pit of their stomachs. Because the universal translators, those ancient and impossibly sophisticated devices gifted to the galactic community by the long-vanished precursors, had not failed. They had translated every word perfectly. What made those listening feel cold was what the translators had added. A small notation appearing at the bottom of every translation matrix in the known galaxy. A notation that only appeared when the precursor algorithms detected something they classified with a specific, unique designation. The notation read, Warning Predator Apex Vocalization Detected. Context, Coordinated Pack Assertion. Recommended Response, Immediate Submission or Flight. The notation had only appeared 3 times in recorded galactic history. Each time something had died. 3 standard months earlier. The Velthara crisis had begun, as so many galactic crises did with the Kren. The Kren were a fungus-based symbiotic species that had spread across 47 worlds in the outer spiral arm. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They did not build fleets or march armies. They simply grew. Their spores, carried on the solar winds in the wake of passing ships, would find purchase on a world and begin the slow, patient work of integration. On dead worlds, this was a miracle of terraforming. The Kren could turn a barren rock into a living ecosystem within a few decades. On living worlds, it was an ecological catastrophe of the first order. Velthara was a living world. It was home to approximately 300 million Velt, a reptilian species that had achieved early industrial civilization and was on the cusp of developing their own fledgling spaceflight capabilities when the Kren spores arrived. The Velt were not members of the Conclave. They had not even known the Conclave existed. They had been happily building their first orbital telescope and arguing about whether their world was round or flat. Yes, even in spacefaring eras, some species had flat worlders, when the first pale threads of Kren mycelium began appearing in their southern forests. By the time the Conclave detected the contamination, it had already spread across 14% of Velthara's landmass. The Kren were not malicious. They did not understand that what they were doing was destructive. To them, they were simply extending the network, bringing life where there was none. The fact that the none in question happened to include entire Velt ecosystems was, to the Kren consciousness, a regrettable but necessary phase of integration. The Conclave debated. They always debated. There were 17 distinct species represented in the Conclave, and each had its own perspective on the Velthara situation. The Tenlar argued for quarantine and diplomatic negotiation with the Kren. The Maroki, a silicon-based species from a high-gravity world, suggested orbital bombardment of the contaminated zones. The Filani, aqueous beings who communicated through bioluminescent patterns, proposed introducing a modified Kren strain that could coexist with native ecosystems. The Helkari, massive armored beings from a volcanic world, simply said let it sort itself out, which was their response to most things. The debate might have continued for decades. Conclave debates often did. But then the humans arrived. Humanity had been a member of the Conclave for barely 6 standard years. They were, by galactic standards, utterly primitive. Their technology was crude, their ships were slow, their understanding of precursor physics was rudimentary at best. They had not even achieved reliable faster-than-light travel on their own. The Conclave had gifted them the basic principles of spatial folding as a gesture of goodwill after first contact, and human engineers had been frantically duct-tapping their own modifications onto the borrowed technology ever since. But the humans had something that no other species in the Conclave possessed. They had doctors. Not in the way that other species had medical professionals. Every spacefaring species had developed some form of medicine. But human medicine was different. Human medicine was not merely the application of scientific principles to biological problems. Human medicine was, in the words of Tenler Chief Medical Advisor Felnara, the concentrated and weaponized expression of the species' fundamental refusal to accept that anything, anywhere, at any time has the right to die. This was not hyperbole. When the humans had first shared their medical databases with the Conclave, the Tenler medical establishment had been forced to completely restructure their understanding of the field. Humans had developed surgical techniques that bordered on the absurd, cracking open a patient's chest cavity, stopping their heart, repairing the organ beneath it, and then restarting the heart and sealing the cavity as though this were a perfectly reasonable thing to do to a living being. They had developed chemical compounds that could destroy infections with a specificity that bordered on targeted assassination. They had devised methods of replacing failed organs with organs taken from other humans, sometimes from living donors, who would simply give away a piece of themselves to save another. The Tenler, who reproduced through egg-laying and considered their bodies to be sacred temples to the cycle of life, had been physically ill when they learned about organ donation. The humans had also brought something else to the table, something that the galactic community had never seen before and still struggled to comprehend. They called them combat medics. The concept was simple enough to understand in theory: medical personnel who were embedded with military units and trained to provide care under fire. Every species could grasp the intellectual framework. What they could not grasp was the reality of it, because a human combat medic was, by every measurable standard, a contradiction in terms. They were individuals who had been trained to kill with brutal efficiency, the same as any soldier, but who had then been additionally trained to undo death, to stitch together the very bodies that their comrades were trying to tear apart, and to do so while bullets and shrapnel and energy beams screamed around them. They were, in essence, beings who could transition from dealing death to preserving life in the span of a heartbeat, and who felt no apparent cognitive dissonance about this. The Filani philosophers had spent 3 standard years debating whether this indicated a profound spiritual duality within the human species or a complete absence of one. They had reached no conclusions. So when the humans heard about Velthara, about a world being slowly consumed by an unknowing biological force, about 300 million sentient beings facing extinction not through malice but through indifference, they did something that no other species had done. They volunteered, all of them. Not the human military, the human medical community. Within 48 hours of the Conclave's formal request for assistance, every major human medical organization on Earth and its colonies had mobilized. Doctors Without Borders, the name itself was a statement of principle, a declaration that the boundaries nations drew meant nothing in the face of suffering, took the lead. They were joined by the International Red Cross and Red Crescent, by hundreds of university teaching hospitals, by military medical corps who volunteered their personnel as individuals rather than as soldiers, by retired surgeons who came out of retirement, by medical students who had not yet graduated but who showed up at the embarkation points with their textbooks in their bags and fear in their eyes, and an absolute refusal to be left behind. In the span of 2 weeks, humanity had assembled the largest medical mission in galactic history. 12,000 human medical personnel, supported by 4,000 logistics staff, transported aboard a fleet of 47 ships, most of them converted cargo vessels, none of them warships heading for Velthara. They brought with them enough medical supplies to treat a continent, surgical suites that could be deployed from shipping containers, portable diagnostic equipment, pharmaceuticals that the Conclave's pharmacologists had never seen, and packed in cases that were handled with particular care by personnel who understood exactly what they contained, biological countermeasures specifically designed to target and neutralize Kren mycelium without harming native plant life. The humans had developed the countermeasures in 11 days. 11 days to solve a problem that the Conclave's best biological scientists had been wrestling with for months. When asked how they had done it, Dr. Sarah Chen, the mission's chief science officer, had shrugged and said, "We've been fighting infections since before we knew what germs were. Fungus is just a really stubborn infection." The mission had arrived at Velthara to find a world in crisis. The Kren contamination had spread to 22% of the landmass. Velt populations in the affected zones were dying, not from the Kren directly, but from the cascading ecological collapse that the fungal overgrowth caused. Native plants were being smothered. Herbivore species were starving. Carnivore species that depended on the herbivores were following. The Velt, caught in the middle, were watching their food supply vanish beneath a pale, creeping carpet of alien fungus. And the humans had gone to work. They worked in shifts that would have killed any other species. 20-hour cycles were common. 30-hour cycles were not unheard of. The Tendler support staff, who required 8 hours of rest per 12-hour activity cycle, found the humans' stamina physically impossible to comprehend. The humans did not seem to tire. They did not seem to falter. They moved through the contaminated zones in their environmental suits, deploying countermeasures with mechanical precision, setting up field hospitals in Velt villages, training Velt healers in basic techniques that the humans considered elementary but that the Velt had never conceived of. The Velt had been stunned. They had not known that other species existed. They had not known that the galaxy was full of beings who could travel between stars. And now, strange creatures from a world they had never heard of were walking through their dying forests, injecting something into the ground that made the pale fungus wither and die, and then turning around and healing their sick with a gentleness that belied the fearsome appearance of their armored suits. The human doctors had learned basic Velt physiology within the first week. By the second week, they were performing surgeries that the Velt's own healers had declared impossible. By the third week, Velt children, who had initially hidden from the strange, soft-skinned aliens, were following the human medics around, fascinated by their bizarre ways and the small treats they always seemed to have in their pockets. Dr. James Ockafer, a pediatric surgeon from Lagos turned field hospital director, had become something of a legend among the Velt of the southern provinces. He had performed 147 surgeries in a single 26-hour shift, saving the lives of Velt adults, children, and elders who had been given up for dead by their own healers. When a Velt elder had asked him why he did this, why he worked until he could barely stand, why he gave so much of himself to beings he had never known, Ockafer had smiled and said something that the Velt translators rendered as, "Because you are alive, and being alive means you deserve a chance to stay that way." The Velt had no equivalent concept in their language. The closest they could come was a phrase that roughly translated to the sacred obligation of breath. They had begun using it to describe the humans. It was, by all accounts, a miracle. The Kren contamination was being pushed back. The Velt were being saved. The Conclave was already drafting resolutions to award the human medical mission the highest order of the living spiral, the most prestigious honor in galactic diplomacy. And then the Carthan Dominion had arrived. The Carthan Dominion was not a member of the Conclave. They were not invited to be a member of the Conclave. They were, in fact, the primary reason the Conclave maintained a combined defense fleet. The Carthan were predators. Not in the philosophical sense that some species use the term, no metaphorical apex hunters, no spiritual hunters of knowledge or meaning. They were literal biological predators who had evolved on a world where every living thing was either hunting or being hunted, and who had carried that evolutionary imperative with them into the stars. They were large, 2.5 meters tall on average, with armored exoskeletons, 4 arms ending in scythe-like claws, and mouths full of serrated teeth designed for tearing flesh from bone. They were also, by every metric the Conclave could devise, absolutely insane. Not mentally ill, not deranged in a way that any medical professional could diagnose and treat, insane in a deeper, more fundamental way. The Carthan had never in their entire recorded history developed a concept that other species could recognize as mercy. They had no word for compassion. Their language had terms for useful, harmful, prey, rival, and pack, and virtually nothing else that related to interactions between beings. The Carthan did not conquer worlds for resources or territory or strategic advantage. They conquered worlds because they enjoyed it. The act of hunting, of pursuing, of bringing down something that fought back, this was the highest expression of Carthan existence. And when they had exhausted the prey on their own worlds, they had looked to the stars and seen an entire galaxy full of new things to hunt. The Conclave had fought 3 major wars against the Carthan Dominion. The first had been a near disaster. stopped only by the intervention of a Tendler fleet that had sacrificed itself to buy time for civilian evacuations. The second had been a stalemate, with Conclave forces managing to hold a defensive line but unable to push the Carthan back. The third had ended in a fragile ceasefire after the Maroki had demonstrated a new weapon, essentially a targeted gravity generator that could crush Carthan warships like tin cans, and the Carthan had, for the first time in their history, retreated. But the ceasefire was just that, a cessation of active hostilities, not a peace treaty. The Carthan still raided. They still attacked isolated outposts and undefended colonies, and they still, above all else, hunted. The Carthan had been watching the Velthara situation with growing interest, not because they cared about the Velt or the Kren, but because the concentration of soft, vulnerable targets in one location, the medical mission, the aid workers, the civilian populations, was, to a Carthan sensibility, irresistible. They had arrived without warning. A fleet of 67 warships dropping out of FTL directly above Velthara. No declaration of intent, no demand for surrender, no communication of any kind. Just sudden, overwhelming force directed at a planet full of healers and the beings they were trying to save. The Conclave Defense Escort, 12 ships, lightly armed because this was a humanitarian mission, not a military operation, had been destroyed in the opening salvo. 642 beings from 7 species had died in less than 4 minutes. The Carthan had not even bothered to target the engines first. They had hit the bridges, the medical bays, the crew quarters. Maximum casualties. Maximum terror. Then the dropships had come. Hundreds of them descending through Velthara's atmosphere like a plague of metal locusts. They landed in and around the human medical encampments with surgical precision. The Carthan were monsters, but they were not stupid monsters. They had clearly identified the human medical personnel as the primary targets and had planned their assault accordingly. What followed was not a battle. A battle implies two sides fighting. What happened in the medical camps was a slaughter. The human medical personnel were not soldiers. Many of them had never held a weapon in their lives. They were surgeons and nurses and pediatricians and epidemiologists. They were beings who had dedicated their existences to the preservation of life, and they found themselves facing creatures that had dedicated their existences to the taking of it. Dr. Miriam Vasquez, a trauma surgeon from Buenos Aires, was in the middle of operating on a Velt child when the first Carthan warriors burst into her field hospital. She had looked up from her patient, a 4-year-old Vlet with a ruptured organ that she had been painstakingly repairing for the past 3 hours, and seen the armored forms filling the doorway, their scythe claws already wet with blood. She had not run, she had not fought. She had placed her body over the child on the operating table and said, in a voice that witnesses later described as utterly calm, "You will not touch this patient." The Carthan had killed her with a single swipe of their claws. Then they had killed the child. Then they had killed everyone else in the hospital. This scene, or variations of it, played out across dozens of locations simultaneously. Human doctors standing between their patients and the killers. Human nurses refusing to abandon the wounded. Human logistics personnel using their own bodies as shields, not because they thought they could win, not because they had any hope of survival, but because they were healers and healers did not abandon those in their care. In the space of 43 minutes, the Carthan killed 4,217 human medical personnel. They killed 812 Tendler aid workers. They killed 341 Maroki engineers who had been building water purification systems. They killed 1,904 Velt civilians. They did not take prisoners. They did not accept surrenders. They did not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants because, to the Carthan mind, there was no such distinction. There was only prey. And then, satisfied with their hunt, they had settled in to wait, because the Carthan knew something about humans that most of the galaxy did not. They had encountered human ships before, small, crude, technologically inferior vessels that the Carthan had swatted aside with contemptuous ease. They had assessed humanity as a weak, soft species, barely worthy of notice. The fact that these weak, soft beings had come to Velthara to heal instead of to fight had only confirmed the Carthan's low opinion. They did not know about the signal. The signal had gone out from Velthara's surface 17 minutes into the attack. It had not been sent by the human mission leadership. It had been sent by a single piece of equipment, a small, unremarkable-looking device that had been included in the medical mission's supply manifest under the designation Emergency Beacon Type 7 Standard. The device was not standard. It was not, strictly speaking, an emergency beacon at all. It was a quantum-entangled communication relay linked to a single specific location in human-controlled space, a location that did not appear on any conclave star chart. a location that, when Conclave intelligence analysts had first become aware of its existence, had caused a level of alarm that the normally stoic Maroki had expressed through a rare and telling silence. The relay operated on a principle that the Conclave's physicists could not fully explain. It did not transmit through normal space. It did not transmit through subspace. It transmitted through something that human scientists called, with characteristic bluntness, the backdoor, a theoretical framework that suggested that the universe had a kind of shadow architecture, a secondary layer of reality that underlay normal spacetime and could be accessed through sufficiently precise manipulation of quantum states. The humans had discovered this shadow architecture entirely by accident, when a physicist named Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been trying to develop a better coffee maker, and had instead accidentally created a hole in the fabric of reality that had briefly connected her laboratory to a point approximately 700 light-years away. The fact that Dr. Tanaka's first response to this had been to try to send a coffee mug through the hole said everything that needed to be said about the human species. The shadow architecture had turned out to be useful for exactly one thing: instantaneous communication across any distance. The humans had quietly built a network of quantum-entangled relays that could transmit information to any other relay in the network with zero latency. No delay, no signal degradation, no possibility of interception by conventional means. When the Type 7 beacon activated, the signal reached its destination in less than a Planck instant. And at that destination, a facility buried deep beneath the surface of a moon that the humans had designated Perdition, a single message appeared on a screen that only 17 humans in the galaxy had the clearance to read. The message was brief. It read, "Velthara, medical mission under attack, KARTHEN Dominion, healers down, REQSTNG immediate deployment per Protocol 7. Protocol 7. In the 6 years since humanity had joined the Conclave, Protocol 7 had never been activated. It had been written into existence by a committee that included 3 generals, 2 intelligence directors, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and a retired Marine Corps commandant who had personally fought in 7 conflicts and who had once, according to legend, killed an armored vehicle with a rock, a piece of wire, and what witnesses described as an insulting amount of confidence. Protocol 7 was the human response to a scenario that every other species in the galaxy considered unthinkable: the deliberate, targeted killing of unarmed human medical personnel. The Conclave had rules of war. Every spacefaring species had rules of war. Even the Karthan had rules of war, though theirs were more accurately described as guidelines for efficient hunting, and every set of rules in the galaxy included protections for medical personnel. The idea that you would specifically target doctors and nurses and medics was so fundamentally repugnant to every civilized species that it was treated not merely as a crime, but as an abomination, a violation of the most basic compact that sentient beings could make with one another. The humans agreed, but where other species responded to violations of medical neutrality with diplomatic protests, sanctions, and strongly worded resolutions, the humans had written Protocol 7. Protocol 7 stated, in language that was remarkably plain for a military document, if unarmed human medical personnel are deliberately targeted and killed by an identifiable hostile force, the United Earth Defense Authority is authorized to deploy Angel assets to the location of the attack with the mandate to neutralize the hostile force, secure the area, and extract any surviving human personnel. Rules of engagement are unrestricted. Authorization for deployment is pre-approved. No further command authority is required. Angel assets. The term meant nothing to the Conclave. The Conclave did not know what angels were. The Conclave did not know that the humans maintained a special operations force that existed entirely outside the normal military chain of command. The Conclave did not know that this force had been created in secret, trained in secret, and equipped with technology that the rest of humanity's military did not even know existed. The Conclave did not know, because the humans had decided that some things were better left unshared. At the facility on Perdition, the message sat on the screen for exactly 3 seconds before it was acknowledged. Then a single command was entered, and the machinery of Protocol 7 began to move. Deep beneath the moon's surface, in chambers carved from bedrock and lined with materials that absorbed every known form of radiation, beings who had been waiting for this moment began to wake up. The Karthan had been on Velthara for 6 hours when the first anomalous readings appeared on their shipboard sensors. Fleet Commander Kreshtek, a veteran of 47 hunting expeditions across 23 star systems, studied the readings with a growing sense of confusion. His sensor officer, a subordinate named Vrash, whose competence Kreshtek had always considered barely adequate, was reporting gravitational distortions in Velthara's upper atmosphere, not the kind of distortions caused by a ship dropping out of FTL. These were smaller, more localized, dozens of them, possibly hundreds. Interference from the planetary surface, Kreshtek asked. Vrash's mandibles clicked in a gesture that, among the Karthan, indicated uncertainty. Negative, Commander, the distortions are above the atmosphere. They appear to be descending. Descending toward what? Toward the surface, Commander, toward our positions. Kreshtek felt the first faint stirring of something he had not experienced in many years. Not fear. The Karthan did not feel fear, but something adjacent to it. A primitive instinct buried deep in the evolutionary substrate of his predatory brain that whispered that something was wrong. Are they ships? He asked. The distortions are too small for conventional vessels. The mass signatures are. Vrash paused. Commander, the mass signatures are inconsistent with any known vessel configuration. They are approximately. Another pause, longer this time. Commander, each signature is approximately the mass of a single Karthan warrior. Kreshtek stared at his sensor officer. You are telling me that there are hundreds of objects, each the mass of a warrior, descending from orbit without any detectable propulsion system. Yes, Commander. That is impossible. Yes, Commander. Kreshtek turned to his tactical display. The descending objects were now visible as faint blips, raining down toward the surface in a pattern that was not random. It was coordinated. It was precise. It was targeting every Karthan ground position simultaneously. Scramble interceptors, Kreshtek ordered, target the descending objects. The Karthan interceptors rose from the fleet's landing bays, fast, agile craft designed for atmospheric combat. They streaked toward the descending blips with the confidence of a species that had never encountered an atmospheric threat they could not handle. The first interceptor reached a descending object and opened fire. Its weapons were energy-based, designed to vaporize unarmored targets and punch through light shielding. The shots hit the descending object dead center. The object did not even flinch. The interceptor pilot had time for a single startled vocalization before the object, now close enough for the pilot's visual sensors to resolve it into a shape, reached out and touched the interceptor's hull with something that looked remarkably like a hand. The interceptor ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not exploded. Simply ceased to exist, converted from matter into something that the Karthan sensors could not identify, a burst of energy that registered on every wavelength simultaneously and then vanished. The pilot's last transmission was a scream. This scene repeated itself 17 times in the span of 40 seconds. 17 Karthan interceptors, each destroyed by a descending object that they could not damage, could not evade, and could not understand. Kreshtek watched the tactical display with something that was definitely not fear, but was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from it. Vrash, he said slowly, what am I looking at? Vrash's mandibles were clicking so rapidly that they were producing an audible whine. Commander, the descending objects have reached the surface. They are Commander, they are engaging our ground forces. Engaging how? There was a long pause. When Vrash spoke again, his voice had changed. The confident, slightly sycophantic tone of a subordinate reporting to a superior was gone. In its place was something raw, something that Kreshtek had never heard from a Karthan warrior. Horror. Commander, they are killing them. That is what engaging means, Vrash. No, Commander, you do not understand. They are killing them, all of them. Every ground unit is reporting casualties, every unit, simultaneously. Commander, 3rd Claw at the Southern Medical Camp, 200 warriors, they are all dead. The entire Claw, dead in, Vrash checked his readings. Dead in 11 seconds, Commander. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. 200 Karthan warriors. Each one a 2.5-meter-tall armored predator with 4 arms of killing implements, born and raised from hatching to be the perfect hunting machine. 200 of them, dead in 11 seconds. Vrash, Kreshtek said, and his voice was very quiet. Show me. The tactical display shifted to a feed from one of the ground units, a helmet camera from a warrior in 5th Claw, stationed at what had been the human medical camp near Velthara's northern continental shelf. The feed was choppy, fragmented by interference that Kreshtek's engineers could not identify, but what it showed was clear enough. The camera's wearer was running. A Karthan warrior born to hunt was running, not towards something, away from it. Behind the warrior, visible in the camera's narrow field of view, was something that Kreshtek's brain struggled to process. It was humanoid in shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but that was where the resemblance to any known species ended. It was clad in armor that was not armor. It was something else, something that seemed to absorb light and radiate darkness. It moved with a fluidity that was not merely fast but wrong, as though it existed in a slightly different relationship with time than everything around it. And it was carrying weapons. Not energy weapons, not projectile weapons, not any category of weapon that the Carthan military databases contained. The beings held devices that looked like elongated crystals, and from the tips of these crystals streamed something that was not quite energy and not quite matter, a form of destruction that did not burn or blast or cut but simply unmade. Carthan warriors caught in its path did not explode or collapse. They ceased. One moment they were there, alive, armored, dangerous. The next moment they were not. The being in the camera feed killed 14 Carthan warriors in 3 seconds. It did not pause. It did not slow down. It moved through the Carthan formation like a wave moving through water, fluid, inevitable, irresistible. The camera's wearer turned a corner, and for a single frame the being looked directly at the lens. Its face was hidden behind a visor, but something about the shape of the head, the set of the shoulders, was unmistakably, horrifyingly familiar. It was human. Kreshtek felt the horror settle into his carapace like ice. Vrash, he said, those are humans. Yes, Commander. Humans, the soft ones, the hailers. The same species, Commander, but these are, Vrash's voice cracked. Commander, these are not healers. No, they were not. Sergeant Major David Kowalski had not slept in 31 hours, but sleep was the last thing on his mind. He stood in the ruins of what had been a human field hospital, surrounded by the bodies of Carthan warriors, and felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, not satisfaction, nothing. The emptiness was not a defect, it was a feature. It had been trained into him over 11 years of selection, evaluation, and enhancement. The angels did not feel in the field. Feeling was for later if there was a later and if the therapist said it was allowed. Around him, the rest of Angel Team 7 was completing their sweep. There were 6 of them: Kowalski, Chen, Okonkwo, Petrov, Nakamura, and Johansson. Each one wore the suit. Each one carried the tools. Each one had been enhanced in ways that the rest of humanity's military could not imagine. The suit was not armor in any conventional sense. It was a wearable extension of the shadow architecture that Dr. Tanaka had accidentally discovered. It existed partially in normal space and partially in the back door, and this dual existence gave its wearer capabilities that violated several fundamental principles of physics. The suit could manipulate local gravity, allowing the wearer to move at speeds that should have turned their internal organs to paste. It could deflect incoming energy weapons by shunting the energy into the back door, where it simply ceased to exist. It could enhance the wearer's strength to the point where a single punch could crater armor plating. And the weapons, the crystal devices that the Carthan had encountered, were even more esoteric. They were called disruption lances in the Angels' clinical terminology, and they worked by severing the quantum bonds that held matter together. Point a disruption lance at something and that something stopped being matter. There was no defense against it. There was no countermeasure. You could not armor against it because armor was matter and matter was what it destroyed. The Angels had been created for one purpose: to be the absolute final expression of humanity's capacity for violence. They were the counterweight to the healers, the shadow that the light cast. For every doctor who placed their body over a patient, there was an angel who would place themselves between the threat and everything that threat could ever reach. Kowalski checked his tactical display. Angel Team 7's assigned sector was clear, all Carthan forces eliminated, 0 friendly casualties, 0 civilian casualties, mission parameters met. He opened the team channel, 7 actual to all elements, sector clear, report status. The responses came in rapid sequence. Each team member confirmed their sector clear. Each reported 0 friendly casualties. Each reported 0 collateral damage. This was not unusual. The Angels did not take casualties. The Angels did not cause collateral damage. They were too precise, too fast, too perfect for either. They had been designed that way. The humans who had created them had understood something fundamental about their species, that humanity's capacity for violence when properly directed and unconstrained was not merely formidable, it was transcendent. 7 actual to Overwatch, Sector 7 clear, moving to extraction point. Overwatch copies 7, all Angel teams report sectors clear, fleet assets are moving to engage Carthan orbital elements. Mission is proceeding to plan. Kowalski acknowledged and began moving toward the extraction point. As he moved, he passed through what had been the hospital's pediatric ward. The beds were overturned, the walls were splattered with blood, human and Velt. On the floor, partially covered by a collapsed tent canvas, he saw the small form of a Velt child, 4 years old approximately based on the size. It was curled into a fetal position, unmoving. Kowalski stopped. He stood over the child for a long moment. Behind his visor, his face was expressionless. The suit systems reported his biometrics as perfectly stable. Heart rate 62, breathing regular, cortisol levels nominal. He reached down and gently moved the canvas aside. The child stirred. It was alive. Wounded, lacerations, contusions, signs of shock, but alive. Kowalski knelt beside the child. He was 2 meters tall in the suit, an armored figure of death, kneeling in the rubble of a destroyed hospital next to a creature the size of a house cat. The juxtaposition should have been absurd. It was not. He activated his suit's medical subsystem, a suite of diagnostic and treatment tools that had been integrated into the Angels' equipment precisely because the mission planners knew that the Angels would be operating in areas where healers had been. The subsystem scanned the child and reported its injuries with clinical precision. Kowalski administered a stabilized broad-spectrum regenerative compound from the suit's medical stores, a compound that the human medical mission had developed specifically for Velt physiology. The child's breathing steadied. Its eyes opened, large, amber, reptilian eyes that looked up at the armored figure looming over it with an expression that Kowalski could not read and did not try to. "Help is coming," Kowalski said. His voice, filtered through the suit's external speakers, was flat and mechanical. "Stay here, stay under this, someone will find you." The child made a small sound. The translators in Kowalski's suit rendered it as a distress call, a vocalization that Velt juveniles made when they were alone and frightened. Kowalski hesitated. Protocol dictated that he move to the extraction point. Protocol dictated that he not deviate from the mission plan. Protocol dictated that he leave the child where it was and let the follow-on medical teams handle it. Kowalski picked up the child, tucked it inside the suit's chest cavity, a space that was technically a life support compartment, but that the Angels had discovered could accommodate a small being in need of protection, and continued toward the extraction point. Behind him, the last of the Carthan bodies cooled in the Veltheran air. In orbit, the Carthan fleet was dying. The human fleet had arrived 47 minutes after the Angels had deployed. Unlike the medical mission's converted cargo vessels, these ships were warships. They were still crewed by Conclave standards, slower, less maneuverable, armed with weapons that Maroki engineers considered quaint. But they were warships, crewed by humans who had been waiting for this moment since the first reports of the attack had reached Earth. And they were not alone. The Conclave defense fleet had arrived simultaneously, responding to Counselor Orenvex's distress call with a speed that surprised even the humans. The Tendler had sent everything they had: 70 warships, their crimson hulls blazing with determination. The Maroki had sent 40 ships, each one a mountain of duranium and weapons. The Fulani had sent 20 ships that were not warships in any conventional sense, but that carried biological weapons specifically designed to target Carthan physiology. The Helkari had sent 12 ships, which was a significant commitment for a species that considered sending ships to be a minor concession to the silliness of interstellar politics. In total, 144 Conclave warships had arrived at Velthara, and they had arrived angry. The Carthan fleet, which had seemed so unstoppable when it was attacking undefended medical convoys, found itself caught between the Conclave fleet and the human fleet. The battle was short and decisive. The human ships, while technologically inferior, fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. They closed to point-blank range, ignored damage that would have caused any other species' crews to retreat, and poured fire into Carthan hulls with a sustained intensity that their weapons should not have been capable of maintaining. The Conclave fleet, for its part, fought with a precision and coordination that the Carthan had never encountered. The Tendler Admiral, a scarred veteran named the Lara who had lost her entire previous command to a Carthan raid, executed a flanking maneuver that was so perfectly timed it seemed rehearsed. The Maroki ships activated their gravity weapons, crushing Carthan vessels in localized singularities. The Fulani ships released their biological payloads, and across the Carthan fleet, warriors began to cough and choke as agents tailored to their exoskeletal biology ate through their armor from the inside. In the span of 2 hours, the Carthan fleet was destroyed, not defeated, destroyed. 67 warships reduced to debris and expanding clouds of gas, not a single Carthan vessel escaped. But the Angels had already finished their work on the surface before the orbital battle had concluded. The aftermath was measured in numbers, and the numbers were terrible. 4,217 human medical personnel dead. The Carthan had not discriminated. They had killed doctors, nurses, orderlies, logistics staff, administrators, and the chaplains who had accompanied the mission to provide spiritual support. They had killed the old and the young, the experienced and the newly graduated. They had killed beings whose only crime had been trying to save lives. 812 Tendler dead, 341 Maroki dead, 1,904 Velt dead. Total casualties, 7,274. Carthan casualties, every single one of the 18,400 warriors they had deployed to the surface, plus every member of their fleet crews, approximately 92,000 beings. Total Carthan losses over 110,000. The ratio was not merely one-sided. It was, by any military standard in galactic history, unprecedented. The Conclave investigation team that arrived at Velthara 3 days after the battle spent most of its time trying to understand what had happened. The Carthan ground forces had been annihilated by the Angels with a thoroughness that defied analysis. Autopsies of Carthan bodies revealed wounds consistent with disruption lance impacts, quantum bond severance at the molecular level, leaving no residue, no trace, no evidence of the weapon that had been used beyond the perfect, clean absence of matter where living tissue had been. The Angels themselves had departed before the investigation team arrived, every one of them. They had extracted with the same precision and efficiency with which they had fought, appearing at the extraction points, boarding shuttles that dropped from orbit, and vanishing back into the black. They had left behind no equipment, no documentation, no evidence of their presence beyond the bodies they had created. The investigation team did find one thing. In the ruins of the pediatric ward at the Northern Medical Camp, embedded in the rubble where Sergeant Major Kowalski had knelt, they found a small, sealed container of Velt-compatible regenerative compound. It was a human medical supply standard issue for the mission. It had been used, partially emptied, the seal broken, the applicator tip stained with Velt blood. Beside it, curled into a depression in the rubble that was exactly the size and shape of a human chest cavity, was a Velt child. Alive, healed, sleeping. The investigation team noted this in their report. They noted it carefully and with a precision that bordered on reverence, because they understood, even if they could not fully articulate why, that this detail mattered. It mattered not as evidence or data or a line item in a report. It mattered because it was a story about a being of absolute destruction kneeling in the rubble to shelter a child. A story about the species that could produce both the healer who covered a patient with her own body and the warrior who carried a child in the cavity of his armor of death. The Tendler historian Felnara, who was attached to the investigation team, would later write about this moment in her magisterial work The Human Paradox. She wrote, "In all my years of study, I have never encountered a species that so thoroughly embodies contradiction. The humans who died on Velthara were the gentlest beings I have ever known. The humans who avenged them were the most terrifying, and they are the same species, they are the same people. They carry both within them the healer and the destroyer, and they do not see this as a paradox. To a human, the idea that you must choose between mercy and strength is not merely wrong. It is incomprehensible. They do not choose. They are both, always, simultaneously, and it is precisely this refusal to choose that makes them what they are." The report was delivered to the Conclave. The Conclave debated. They debated for 6 weeks. The Tendler argued for a formal condemnation of the Carthan Dominion and a commendation for humanity. The Maroki argued for a preemptive strike against remaining Carthan holdings. The Fulani argued for a meditation period. The Helkari said they attacked healers. Destroy them all, which was the longest sentence any Helkari had contributed to a conclave debate in recorded history. The resolution that eventually passed was unanimous. It condemned the Carthan Dominion in the strongest terms possible under conclave law. It awarded the human medical mission the highest order of the living spiral posthumously. And it included a single clause proposed by Councillor Orenvex that passed without discussion because every being in the conclave chamber understood its necessity without needing to articulate it. The conclave hereby recognizes that the response conducted by human forces at Velthara was proportionate, justified, and conducted in accordance with the inherent right of self-defense. No action taken by human forces during this engagement shall be subject to review, censure, or diplomatic consequence. The conclave further recognizes that the targeting of medical personnel is an act of such fundamental depravity that any response to such an act, up to and including the complete annihilation of the responsible party, is inherently proportionate. It was the most aggressive resolution the conclave had ever passed. It was also, the Tendler diplomats noted with some concern, the first resolution the conclave had ever passed that effectively sanctioned genocide as a proportional response to a specific provocation. No one objected, no one even considered objecting, because every being in the conclave chamber had seen the footage. They had seen the hospitals, they had seen the bodies. They had seen the small, still forms of Velt children who had died on operating tables where humans had been trying to save them moments before. And they had understood something that the humans had always known, and that the Carthan had just learned. You could attack humanity's ships, you could challenge their fleets, you could contest their territory. They would fight you and they might lose, and they would accept that loss because that was how the game of interstellar politics was played. But you could not touch their healers. You could not harm those who had dedicated themselves to the service of life. You could not walk into a hospital and kill the people who were trying to save your victims. Because if you did, the humans would not come with diplomats. They would not come with resolutions. They would not come with warnings. They would send the angels. And the angels would not stop. Epilogue 1 year later. Sergeant Major David Kowalski sat in a small, comfortable room in a building that did not appear on any map. The room was painted in warm colors. There was a window that looked out onto a garden. There was a comfortable chair and a small table with a cup of tea on it. The therapists called it decompression. Kowalski called it mandatory sitting. He was not wearing the suit. He had not worn the suit since Velthara. He did not know where the suit was now, and he did not ask. The suit was a tool, and tools were put away when the job was done. On the table beside the tea was a small handmade object. It was a carving, made from some kind of pale wood, in the shape of a small reptilian creature with large amber eyes. It had been delivered to the facility by a Tendler diplomat who had explained that it was a gift from the Velt of the northern provinces. Specifically, it was a gift from a 4-year-old Velt child who had been found in the ruins of a hospital, curled in a depression in the rubble that the Velt healers said was exactly the size and shape of a human chest cavity. The child had told the Velt elders a story. The child said that a dark spirit had come through the hospital, killing the pale hunters. The dark spirit had found the child and had spoken to it, and the child had understood the spirit's words as, "Help is coming, stay here, stay under this, someone will find you." And then the dark spirit had picked up the child and carried it inside itself, and the child had been warm and safe, and then the spirit had set the child down in a place where helpers found it. The Velt elders, who were still struggling to understand the concept of other species, had interpreted this as a spirit visitation. The Tendler diplomats, who understood the concept of angels but had been wisely told nothing about them, had interpreted it as a child's confused recollection of a traumatic event. Kowalski knew what it was. It was a memory, his memory, the only memory from Velthara that had broken through the trained emptiness. He picked up the carving and held it in his palm. It was lighter than he expected, delicate, carefully made, the work of hands that were not human, crafting a likeness of a being that was not human, in gratitude for an act that no human had ever been trained to perform, but that every human, deep in the oldest parts of their souls, understood without being taught. He set the carving down and picked up the tea. It was cold. He drank it anyway. On the other side of the galaxy, the Carthan Dominion was in collapse, not because of the Conclave's actions. The Conclave was still debating what to do about the Carthan. The collapse was happening because the Carthan themselves had lost the will to continue. The survivors of Velthara, and there were survivors, warriors who had been off-world during the attack, officers who had stayed aboard the fleet's support vessels, had returned to Carthan space with stories that had broken something fundamental in the Carthan psyche. The Carthan were predators. Their entire identity, their entire civilization was built around the concept of the hunt. They were the hunters, everything else was prey. This was not a belief or a philosophy. It was a biological imperative as fundamental to their existence as breathing. And at Velthara, they had encountered something that hunted them. Not something that fought them, not something that defended against them, something that hunted them, something that had descended from the sky with the explicit, unmistakable purpose of finding every Carthan on that planet and killing them. Something that had done so with an efficiency and thoroughness that the Carthan had never demonstrated in their entire history as a species. The Carthan warriors who had survived were not the same. They told their stories and other Carthan listened, and something in the listening Carthan changed. The certainty that they were the ultimate predators, the apex of all hunting, the final expression of predatory evolution, that certainty cracked, and through the crack seeped a doubt that was poison to a species that defined itself by its ability to hunt. The Carthan Dominion did not surrender. The Carthan did not have a concept of surrender. But it began to turn inward. The raiding stopped. The expansion stopped. The great hunting fleets remained in their berths, crewed by warriors who no longer believed in the hunt. The Conclave noted this with cautious optimism. The human government noted it with something closer to satisfaction. The angels noted it not at all because the angels did not note things. They waited. And on Velthara, the human medical mission was rebuilt. New volunteers arrived, more than had come the first time, because the story of what had happened had spread across Earth and its colonies, and the response was not what the Carthan had expected. The humans had not been cowed. They had not been frightened away from the galaxy. They had come back, more of them, with more supplies, with more determination. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had developed the Kren countermeasures in 11 days, returned to lead the science team. She brought with her a new batch of countermeasures that were 3 times as effective as the original. When asked why she had come back to the world where her colleagues had been murdered, to the place that held the worst memories of her life, she had given an answer that was later engraved on the memorial at the site of the Northern Medical Camp. Because the fungus doesn't care that we're sad, and neither do the people who need us. So we go back, that's what we do. The memorial itself was a simple structure, a stone marker set in the middle of the rebuilt hospital complex. On it were carved the names of every being who had died in the attack. Human, Tendler, Maroki, Velt, every name in every script in every language. And at the bottom, in English, a single line that the humans had insisted upon despite the conclave's confusion about its meaning. We are the shepherds, we are the sheepdogs, we are the wolves. The Velt, who were still learning about the wider galaxy, asked what it meant. The human doctors tried to explain. The explanation did not translate well. But the Velt thought about it, and they came up with their own interpretation, rendered in their own language as a phrase that roughly translated to: those who heal, those who guard, and those who avenge, all are human, do not mistake one for the others. It was, by Velt standards, the highest compliment they could pay. By human standards, it was simply accurate. And deep beneath the surface of a moon called Perdition, in chambers that no conclave inspection team would ever be allowed to see, the angels waited for the next signal. Patient, precise, ready. Because the humans understood something that no other species had yet grasped. Something that was not a philosophy or a strategy or a policy, but a simple, immutable fact of their existence. The healers and the angels were not two different things. They were the same thing seen from different angles. The same spark that drove a surgeon to work for 26 hours to save a child drove a warrior to descend from the sky to avenge that surgeon's death. The same refusal to accept that a life could be lost without consequence, without response, without the universe being made to understand that this loss mattered. It was all one thing, one impulse. One species' absolute, uncompromising declaration to a cold and indifferent universe. These are our healers. Touch them and you will learn what we are capable of. We sent the angels once. Do not make us send them again.